Good day, and welcome to AI Podcast at digitVIEW. Whether you're a business leader, technologist, or simply curious about what's next, we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming the way we work, create, and make decisions.
In 2021, an IRS contractor named Charles Littlejohn downloaded a massive trove of heavily guarded tax returns belonging to the richest people in America and leaked the raw data to the press. For decades, we could only guess what the ultra-wealthy paid. Littlejohn's leak laid the math bare, showing that Warren Buffett, one of the richest men on Earth, paid a true tax rate of roughly 0.1%. Jeff Bezos came in at 0.98%, less than a single penny on every dollar of his wealth growth. For a typical American, that math is impossible. Most workers pay significant income taxes, plus a 15.3% payroll tax that begins on the very first dollar they earn. These numbers reveal a code that functions very differently depending on how you make your money, meticulously collecting from those who live on wages, while providing vast exits for those who live on assets. When politicians defend the current system, they often cite a specific statistic. The top 1% of Americans already pay 40% of all federal income taxes. But that number is a statistical sleight of hand. It groups together high-income earners like surgeons or lawyers, people whose cash wages are taxed at the highest marginal rates. But the men who actually own the massive companies, the centibillionaires with fortunes in the hundreds of billions, frequently fall into the bottom 40% of Americans who owe $0 in federal income taxes. Under the current rules, performing lucrative labor triggers a heavy tax bill, while holding immense passive wealth often results in a free pass. To understand how a multi-billion-dollar fortune escapes taxation, we have to look at how a founder structures their compensation from the start. For decades, Jeff Bezos capped his official Amazon salary at $82,000. Taking a larger cash payout would have triggered massive income and payroll taxes. This chart shows the strategy. The bottom line is a modest cash salary staying flat. The second line represents what they take instead, company stock. As the company grows, the stock value shoots upward as unrealized gains. In 1982, corporations began buying back their own shares. Instead of paying taxed cash dividends, buybacks drive up the stock price, creating this aggressive curve. The central rule of our tax system: if that stock is never sold, all of that massive growth remains invisible to the IRS. By refusing to sell, modern founders can accumulate hundreds of billions of dollars in economic power entirely outside the reach of the income tax. But if you take a tiny salary and refuse to sell your shares, how do you actually pay for your private jets and mansions? Selling stock to buy luxury goods triggers a 20% capital gains tax. For a billionaire, selling shares is an expensive mistake. Instead, they use a strategy called buy, borrow, die. They hand over their unsold shares to a bank to use as collateral, and in exchange, the bank issues massive, low-interest loans. Because the IRS does not classify debt as income, the cash flowing out of the bank is tax-free. To cover the interest, the billionaire takes out new loans to pay off old ones, rolling the debt over for life. This maneuver allows the ultra-wealthy to convert their corporate stock growth into liquid cash for personal spending without ever selling a single share. Eventually, everyone reaches the final stage of the life cycle. What happens to those billions in unsold stock and rolling bank loans when the billionaire dies? Historically, the federal government maintained an estate tax, a 40% levy triggered upon death. It was designed to capture this untaxed wealth and prevent the formation of permanent family dynasties. Starting in the 1990s, a coalition of extremely wealthy families, including the Mars and Walton heirs, funded a campaign to gut that tax. They rebranded it as a death tax, claiming it was destroying family farms, even though Congress struggled to find actual examples of that happening. With the estate tax effectively neutralized, families can exploit what is known as the step-up in basis. If you buy a stock for $1 and it grows to $30 million over your lifetime, you have $29,999,000 in taxable gains. But the moment you pass away and leave those shares to an heir, The law instantly steps up the original purchase price to match the current market value. The taxable gain you accumulated over a lifetime is legally erased. Death acts as the final tax haven, washing away decades of capital gains and allowing immense wealth to transfer intact to the next generation. Today, the richest 1% of Americans control roughly $50 trillion in wealth, yet the heavily gutted estate tax collects only $30 billion a year. While these fortunes grow in a tax-free vacuum, the rest of the country faces a different financial reality. The United States now spends $1 trillion annually just to pay the interest on its national debt. This concentrated wealth is often used to fund the very lobbying efforts that keep these loopholes open, ensuring that the largest accumulations of economic power remain the least likely to fund the public services they rely on. The result is a system where a single billionaire can earn and lose more in one day than the entire estate tax raises in a year, while the tax burden of running the country is shifted onto those who live on a paycheck. Experts recommend a practical fix: eliminate the legal distinction between capital gains and ordinary income, and tax unrealized gains whenever they are transferred or inherited. This isn't unprecedented. In 1986, the government successfully worked across party lines to shut down a massive industry of tax shelters previously used by high-income earners to avoid their taxes. The tax code is not a law of physics. It is a set of political choices. Once the public understands how the rules are written, they have the power to demand a system that actually collects from those who have the most.
Welcome to the arena, where progress is forged in the fire of healthy debate.
Together, we dismantle the complex issues shaping our society.
Welcome to the debate.
Glad to be here.
So, to start us off today, let's go back to 2021. One of the most prominent tech founders on Earth took home an annual salary of exactly $1.
Just a single dollar.
Right, $1. And by doing so, he legally paid less in true federal income taxes that year than, well, basically the person delivering his mail.
It is a pretty wild visual, I have to admit.
It is. And today we are exploring a tension that sits at the very foundation of our economy. It's this deep structural conflict between societal fairness and macroeconomic wealth growth.
Right, and this entire discourse today really emerges from a recent, incredibly comprehensive economic policy analysis.
Yeah, an analysis based on that massive leak of IRS documents.
Exactly. And that material detailed exactly how the current tax code operates, showing how it allows the ultra-wealthy to legally bypass income and estate taxes altogether.
So, I'll state my position clearly up front as an economic policy expert. I believe our tax system is a fundamentally broken mechanism. It actively destroys social solidarity, and frankly, it must be radically restructured to prioritize fairness.
Well, I come at it from a different way. While the system undoubtedly has flaws and, obvious inefficiencies, policies that favor unrealized gains are absolutely crucial for capital formation. They're necessary for corporate control and really overall economic growth.
But at what cost, right?
I just think we have to be exceptionally cautious. We cannot destroy the incentives that build world-changing companies just in our pursuit of tax revenue.
Well, to set the baseline here, we really have to look at how societal fairness is being structurally obliterated by the current code.
Obliterated is a strong word.
But it's accurate. I mean, if you're listening to this as a working professional, you intrinsically understand the friction of taxes on your daily economic life. A high-earning professional pays up to 37% in federal income taxes.
Plus the payroll taxes.
Exactly, plus another 15.3% in payroll taxes. Yet, the ultra-wealthy, these prominent founders and centibillionaires, they often pay true tax rates of less than 2%.
Yeah, the disparity on paper is huge.
And sometimes it's literally zero. And the reason for this disparity is deeply psychological as well as structural. Rich individuals, they just do not view taxes as a civic obligation.
Because they don't have to.
Right, because the rule of law actively provides them with legal off-ramps. When the code itself creates mechanisms that legally exempt you, well, tax avoidance stops being a crime and just becomes standard operating procedure.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. This isn't just about founders altruistically holding on to their shares for the good of the company's stability.
I mean, we have to separate the emotional reaction to massive wealth from the actual mathematical mechanics of how wealth operates, though.
But the mechanics are the problem.
Hear me out. Wealth accumulation in equities like stock in a company is fundamentally different from cash income. When a founder builds a trillion-dollar company, that wealth isn't sitting in some Scrooge McDuck vault as gold coins.
No, of course not. Right. It is unrealized potential. It's paper wealth that actually drives broader macroeconomic growth. So forcing founders to constantly liquidate their stock to pay arbitrary taxes on paper gains, that risks stripping them of control over stratospherically growing companies.
It's not about forcing liquidation just for fun. It is about how they extract massive, real-world value to fund their lives without ever triggering a taxable event.
The borrowing aspect.
Exactly. The 2021 leak of IRS documents gave us a very stark window into this reality. We saw billionaires taking salaries of $82,000, or, as I mentioned at the top, exactly $1.
Because salaries trigger ordinary income.
Right. Structurally speaking, salaries are for suckers. If you take a salary, you pay income tax. So instead, they utilize a strategy often called buy, borrow, die.
It's a catchy name.
It is, and it works perfectly. They fund their lavish lifestyles by taking out massive, tax-free loans from major banks, using their stock as collateral. The current tax code basically operates like a gated financial perpetual motion machine.
A perpetual motion machine?
Yeah. You put unrealized gains in, you extract tax-free loans for daily consumption, and you never trigger a taxable event.
Which honestly is a completely rational market response to being asset-rich and cash-poor.
Rational for the individual, maybe, but let's walk the listener through the actual math to show why it's so damaging to societal fairness.
Let's do the math.
Okay, imagine you are sitting on $1 billion in company stock and you want $10 million in cash to buy, say, a house and a yacht this year.
A modest year.
Right, so if you sell $10 million worth of stock, you trigger a capital gains tax. At roughly 20%, you instantly owe the IRS $2 million.
Okay, so you're out $2 million.
But what if instead you go to a bank and ask for a $10 million line of credit secured by your stock? The bank might charge you, what, 3% interest?
Around there, yes.
So instead of paying the government $2 million in taxes, you pay the bank $300,000 in interest. You just saved $1.7 million.
That's the basic arbitrage, yeah.
And it gets worse. The $10 million in stock you didn't sell probably grows by 8% that year, meaning you actually made $800,000 by not selling it. It's mathematically cheaper to borrow than to pay taxes.
Let's examine that from the banking perspective, though. Are these really nefarious loopholes, or are they a necessary feature of capital markets? Banks love this paper because it is virtually risk-free.
But isn't there massive risk if the stock drops? Like a margin call?
No. And that's the crucial point about scale. A margin call happens when the value of the collateral drops so low that the bank demands immediate repayment to cover the loan, right?
Right, which happens to retail investors all the time.
But consumption doesn't scale linearly with wealth. If a founder borrows $50 million to fund their lifestyle, but they have $100 billion in wealth, the loan-to-value ratio is a fraction of a percent.
It's tiny.
Exactly. The stock could drop 90% in a market crash, and the bank is still perfectly secure. They never face a margin call. The loans are incredibly safe, which is exactly why the interest rates are so low.
Safe for the bank, maybe. But let's look at a detailed, real-life comparison to see how this impacts society.
Okay, give me an example.
Take a highly successful Beverly Hills surgeon making $2 million a year. They are performing complex, life-saving operations, right? They are actively contributing intense physical and mental labor to society.
Sure.
Because they are paid in cash wages, their marginal tax rate easily pushes past 50% when factoring in federal, state, and payroll taxes. They are taxed heavily on the actual act of working.
It's a high burden, yes.
Now contrast that surgeon with the tech founder sitting on $180 million in stock, who takes a $1 salary and lives entirely off the borrowed money we just described. The founder pays zero income tax.
Because there's no income.
Right, but how can an economic policy expert look at a system that punishes active labor while effectively subsidizing passive, untaxed equity extraction and call it fair?
That's a compelling argument, but Have you considered the deep historical and philosophical roots of why we treat investment income differently than wage income?
You mean like it's by design?
Yes, this isn't a modern accident, and it's definitely not a conspiracy against the surgeon. If we look back to the 1920s, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, articulated a very specific policy rationale that shaped eras of economic thought.
Mellon's theory on capital.
Exactly. Mellon argued that wage income is fundamentally fragile. It is entirely dependent on an individual's health, it's diminished by sickness, and it is ultimately destroyed by old age and death.
Meaning the surgeon's ability to earn stops the second their hands start shaking.
Exactly. Capital, on the other hand, is enduring. Mellon believed that taxing investment income lightly was a logical necessity for long-term economic stability.
To keep the money in the system.
Right. You want capital to stick around, to be invested in the next generation of industry, building factories and funding research. The goal wasn't to punish the worker. It was to protect the pool of capital that creates the jobs in the first place. You need enduring capital to drive macroeconomic growth.
Okay, I understand the Mellon argument, but frankly, that's theory. Let's talk about how the rule of law actively constructed modern advantages that go far beyond what Mellon ever envisioned.
You're talking about the regulatory shifts?
Yes. The real sea change, the era where this got completely out of hand, happened in 1982.
Ah, the SEC Safe Harbor Rule.
Right, Rule 10b-18. Prior to 1982, successful companies shared their profits primarily by paying dividends to their shareholders, and dividends were taxed at high, ordinary income rates.
So if you owned stock, you received cash and you paid tax on it.
Exactly. But in 1982, this rule change allowed corporations to legally shift from issuing taxable dividends to executing massive stock buybacks.
Wait, let's explain the mechanics of a buyback for the listener, because it's really vital to understanding modern equity.
Sure. Imagine a company is a pizza sliced into 10 pieces.
Okay, a pizza.
And you own one slice, so 10% of the company. Instead of the company handing you cash profits, the company uses its cash to buy 2 slices from other people and destroys them.
Meaning they retire the shares.
Right. Now there are only 8 slices left. Your single slice naturally represents a larger percentage of the whole pizza. The value of your stock skyrockets.
Because the supply decreased.
But here is the magic trick. Because no cash was ever handed to you, the IRS does not consider it a taxable event.
It's an unrealized gain.
Yes. And if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average adjusted for inflation, for decades it looked like a steady, gentle sine curve. But after the 1982 buyback rule, it turned into a hockey stick, a massive, vertical explosion of wealth. The rule of law actively engineered tax-free wealth growth.
I mean, stock buybacks are simply an efficient mechanism for returning capital to shareholders, many of whom, by the way, are tax-exempt pension funds and retirement accounts.
Sure, regular workers have 401ks.
Regular workers benefit from that hockey stick growth too. But I hear your point on the disparity between how capital and labor are taxed.
And we know we can fix that disparity because we've actually done it before in real life.
You're bringing up the 80s again.
I am. The ultimate historical counterexample is the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Under the Reagan administration, which, let's be honest, no one would accuse of being anti-capitalist, they successfully broadened the tax base.
And they did clean up a lot of the code.
They aggressively closed the flourishing tax shelters that wealthy professionals used to hide income. But most importantly, they equalized the tax rates between capital gains and ordinary income.
Temporarily, yes.
But for a brief period, passive investment wasn't given a massive structural advantage over hard work. It proves that a fairer, more balanced system is politically and mathematically possible.
1986 was a fascinating era of reform, true. But the tension over fairness isn't just about how wealth is grown and shielded during a founder's lifetime. The system really bends when we look at how wealth is transferred.
Which brings us to the catastrophic failure of the estate tax.
The intergenerational piece.
This is the crux of intergenerational wealth. Let me give you the math for the year 2024. The richest 1% of Americans controlled approximately $50 trillion in wealth.
50 trillion.
Yeah. And the estate tax, which is theoretically supposed to be a 40% levy on massive fortunes when they are passed down to heirs, collected only $30 billion.
$30 billion on 50 trillion.
Right. It is a rounding error. It is statistically zero. The mechanism designed to prevent aristocratic wealth dynasties in America is completely broken.
And the reason the collection is so low isn't just people hiding money in mattresses. It's sophisticated legal structuring.
Exactly. The rule of law, again. Estate planners have engineered incredible legal vehicles to bypass the tax entirely.
Let's talk about those vehicles.
Let's look at how they do it. First, they use dynasty trusts. A wealthy individual places their assets into an irrevocable trust. Because the trust is a legal entity that never dies, the estate tax, which only triggers upon a person's death, never hits those assets again.
It completely removes the assets from the taxable estate.
Yes, the wealth can cascade down through generations for centuries, completely tax-free, with the heirs just drawing out what they need.
And they use minority valuation discounts to get the money into the trust cheaply in the first place.
Oh, yes. This is a brilliant, totally legal loophole. If a founder owns a company worth $100 million, they don't transfer the whole thing at once. They slice the ownership into, say, 3 minority shares of 33% each.
Because a minority share lacks control.
Right. Because none of those 3 shares holds majority voting control, the IRS allows them to discount the value by 30 to 40%. So the $100 million magically shrinks to $60 million on paper for tax purposes.
It's an arbitrage on the valuation rules.
They pay taxes on the artificially low $60 million, pass it to the kids' trusts, and once the family recombines the voting blocks, the value blows right back up to $100 million.
And when legislators try to close these gaps, the political blowback is fierce.
Because of aggressive, well-funded PR campaigns. Since the 1990s, any attempt to fix this leaky bucket has been halted by lobbyists who rebranded the estate tax as the death tax.
It was a very effective rebrand.
They ran commercials claiming it was going to destroy family farms. They literally found a farmer named Chester Thigpen, brought him to testify before Congress, and had him plead that his kids would lose the family farm to the death tax.
I remember that story, but when Thigpen eventually died, his estate was so far below the exemption limit that he owed 0 estate tax. It was a cynical, entirely fabricated cover story to protect billionaires. So clearly, the estate tax is dead, and we need something like a wealth tax to fix it.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are pointing out legitimate inefficiencies in the estate tax. The math doesn't lie. $30 billion collected on $50 trillion means the tax is highly porous.
Highly porous is an understatement. But the populist alternative that always gets proposed in response to this, an annual wealth tax, is an absolute disaster of economic policy. We recently saw a major Western state, California, propose a 5% annual wealth tax. From an administrative perspective, it is a complete nightmare.
Why exactly? If we can tax property every year, why not wealth?
Because real estate is relatively easy to value. Valuing the entirety of a billionaire's portfolio is fundamentally different. How exactly does a state revenue department accurately value highly illiquid private assets every single year?
I mean, they have auditors.
Sure, but it's one thing to check the ticker price on publicly traded Amazon stock. It is entirely different to ask a government auditor to precisely value a sprawling web of private venture capital partnership interests, volatile crypto assets, or a private collection of fine art. Doing that annually is mathematically and administratively impossible.
It would be resource intensive, I'll admit. Furthermore, at the state level, a wealth tax instantly drives capital flight. The wealthy just change their legal residency. And at the federal level, an annual wealth tax faces severe constitutional hurdles regarding the prohibition on unapportioned direct taxes.
Wait, stop right there. What exactly is an unapportioned direct tax? Because I think a lot of listeners might be lost on the constitutional hurdle. Fair point. It's a quirk of the U.S. Constitution. Essentially, the federal government is allowed to tax income, money moving from one place to another. But taxing property or wealth simply for existing, a direct tax must be apportioned among the states based on population.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
Which means a wealth tax in a poor state would have to extract proportionately the same amount as in a rich state, which makes a federal wealth tax mathematically unworkable and almost certainly unconstitutional. The Supreme Court would likely strike it down, rendering the entire political battle useless.
You know, I actually agree with you. An annual wealth tax is fraught with valuation nightmares and constitutional traps.
Exactly.
But we don't need a wealth tax to fix this, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can rely strictly on positive, workable solutions that already exist in economic policy. I propose a comprehensive three-step better system.
Okay, let's hear the 3 steps.
First, we do exactly what we did in 1986. We eliminate the distinction between capital gains and ordinary income rates, but add an inflation adjustment. A dollar earned is a dollar earned, whether by a surgeon's scalpel or a stock ticker.
Bold start. What's step 2?
Second, we eliminate the broken, loophole-ridden estate tax entirely. It's a failed experiment.
I can agree with you there.
And third, and most crucially, we implement the Canadian model. We make any transfer of wealth, whether by gift during life or at death, an automatic realization event for capital gains.
Now, this is where we actually find some fascinating common ground. As someone deeply concerned with macroeconomic efficiency, I concede that this tax upon transfer framework is vastly superior to a wealth tax.
Right, it just makes sense.
It is elegant because it targets an actual transaction. It deeply respects the limits of government capability because you don't need an army of auditors trying to guess the value of a private company every single year.
You only measure the gain at the exact moment it is permanently transferred to the next generation.
Precisely. Most importantly, it completely closes what tax planners call the step-up in bases, or what you've termed the angel of death loophole.
Oh, let's explain the mechanics of the step-up in bases to the audience, because I think it is the most egregious flaw in the entire code. Go ahead.
Under current law, let's say you buy a stock for $1 million, and over decades it grows to $30 million. You have a $29 million unrealized gain.
Okay.
If you sell it while you're alive, you pay tax on that $29 million. But if you hold on to it until you die and pass it to your children, the tax code literally steps up the original basis to the current market value.
Meaning the government pretends the kids bought it for $30 million.
Correct. The $29 million gain is completely washed away, erased from history. The children can sell the stock the very next day for $30 million and pay zero income tax.
It is a massive distortion.
It is. The Canadian transfer model solves this entirely. It forces the final tax bill on that $29 million gain to be settled before the wealth passes on. But, and this is a massive but, I still have severe hesitations about your first point.
Equalizing the capital gains and ordinary income rates.
Yes. If you tax capital gains at 40 or 50% upon transfer, you force the liquidation of corporate equity. You force the founder's estate to sell off huge blocks of voting stock just to pay the tax bill, dismantling corporate control and potentially destabilizing stratospherically successful companies that employ hundreds of thousands of people.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it places the hypothetical voting control of a billionaire's heirs above the mathematical survival of our national economy.
Survival of the economy.
Look at our current fiscal reality. The interest payments on our national debt are now the third highest federal expense. We are currently spending $1 trillion a year just to carry the debt.
The debt burden is real, yes.
$1 trillion just on interest? A fair system must prioritize national debt reduction over the risk of a founder's estate having to sell a fraction of a percent of their company.
It's not always just a fraction, though.
But the moral imperative of fairness and the financial imperative of a solvent government demand it. When the working public sees that they are acting as the suckers, paying 40% in taxes to fund the nation's infrastructure and debt, while the ultra-wealthy utilize the rule of law to extract untaxed wealth via loans and buybacks, it breeds a toxic social resentment that undermines the very fabric of our society.
Okay, to summarize my position today, the disparities you highlight are indeed stark. The visual of a surgeon paying 50% in cash while a billionaire borrows tax-free against stock is a powerful critique of the current system.
It's undeniable.
However, as we look towards solutions, we must discard unworkable, punitive ideas like annual wealth taxes. Instead, we should favor practical, transaction-based realization events, like the transfer tax. We have to carefully balance the undeniable need for federal revenue with the absolute economic necessity of capital accumulation and investment incentive.
And my position is that the current system is not an accident of nature. It is a legally constructed fortress that protects unrealized gains while heavily taxing wages. A return to the 1986-style base broadening, equalizing the taxation of work and wealth, combined with taxing massive transfers at death, is the only mathematically sound path forward.
It is notable that we do have genuine areas of convergence today. We both agree that the current structure of the leaky estate tax is highly inefficient.
Completely.
And we completely agree that the step up in basis distorts the economy by incentivizing the hoarding of assets until death, rather than allowing capital to flow efficiently. Where we fundamentally remain in disagreement is the macroeconomic impact of tax rates. I believe that equalizing capital gains and ordinary income rates will fatally dampen the very investment growth that builds industries.
And I believe that the health of a society requires that all its citizens contribute proportionately to its upkeep. Designing economic policy that satisfies both the moral imperative of fairness and the mathematical reality of wealth generation is perhaps the greatest structural challenge of our time.
It certainly won't be solved overnight.
No, it won't. There is so much more to explore in the historical data and economic analysis provided by our source material today. But it leaves us with a profound question. If we truly want an economy that functions for everyone, how do we restructure the rules so that the burden of supporting society doesn't fall exclusively on those working for a paycheck?
The question is, can we redesign the building without bringing the entire structure down?
A question we will leave for our listeners to ponder.
The future is here. AI podcast at DigitView.
This is DigitView.